Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Andy and I usually talk about sex education videos on this channel, so it's a really good reason why you might want to stick around. There's loads to learn. I learn stuff every single week, believe me. Of course, one thing that happened this week was the general election here in the United Kingdom. I'm not going to go into the reasons for the general election, not for this video, is it? But what I am going to talk about this week is the implications of this general election on sex education, and particularly sex education in schools. Now, sex education in schools is obviously the policy of the government of the day, and as we all know, and if you don't, I don't know where you've been, but this election turned out that the Conservatives won a majority in Parliament. And what that basically means is that the Conservatives can do what they like. They don't have to rely on other parties. They don't probably have to worry about too many rebels voting down their plans. So before this video, I thought, I'll tell you what, I'll have a look at the Conservative manifesto to see what they said about relationships and sex education in schools. And they said nothing. It literally wasn't mentioned at all. Not in schools, not anywhere. Nothing about sexual health, nothing about sex education. There was a bit about sexual violence, but it was more in Law and Order than it was anywhere else. But that was your lot. Now you might think that that's awful, and I was hoping there'd be something in there myself. But I have to say, there is actually no particular reason why they should have put anything on sex and relationships education in their manifesto. And that's because there's already government policy being enacted and guidelines put out for this September for sex and relationships education in schools, which will become mandatory from September 2020. I think it's fair to say that they're not going to be changing this guidance between now and September. So I thought I'd delve in and see what they've got. So as I said, this guidance is for sex and relationships education in both primary and secondary schools, and it's going to be mandatory from this coming September. It's quite long and I'm not going to talk about all of it, so I'm just going to pick out a few things, and it's some of what they call the learning objectives. Learning objectives is basically what the children, in this case, whoever you're teaching, should know about at the end of their course or their lessons. So as we all know, I'm a proponent of inclusive sex education, so we shouldn't be just talking about straight relationships. You should be talking about all kinds of relationships, whether that be gay relationships, non-sexual relationships. I think it should be all included in relationships education. And nobody has to talk about the sex angle on these things, all right? That's not a requirement, it's particularly in primary schools. It's not really something which you have to touch upon, right? And this guidance, which is basically written by civil servants, by the way, although accepted by the government, so to their credit, this guidance is very, very comprehensive, which is great. So these guidelines, which I'm about to read out, are for secondary schools. The primary school ones aren't actually that different, but they don't go into quite so much depth as you might expect. So it says here, for example, that in the family section, that there are different types of committed, stable relationships. It says why marriage is an important choice for people and why it must be freely entered into. There are specific laws in the country against forced marriages, for example, so it's really important that kids know about that. When talking about relationships in general, it says that the child should be aware of the characteristics of positive and healthy friendships. So it's not just about sexual relationships. So for example, reconciliation and ending relationships, this includes different and non-sexual relationships. So it's not, as some people have tried to make out, about teaching young kids about why gay is better than being straight. I mean, that's just not the case, right? It's not what they're trying to be taught. They're trying to be taught why certain type of relationships exist, and particularly in things like breaking up, you know? It's an important step in a child's development. And I think we can all agree, those of us that have been through the education system here in the UK that we didn't really get taught this kind of stuff. It was more like, oh, you might get broken up and it's really sad, right? You might get broken up. I mean, you might break up. Yes. So it also goes on to talk about potentially abusive relationships, so coercion and violent relationships, and to spot the warning signs, not just in your relationships, but in other people's relationships, and ways that you can help them or ways that you can get other people to help them. Very importantly, it includes what constitutes sexual harassment, because, and it says here, these are always unacceptable. Fantastic. We've actually got somebody teaching young kids, particularly young men, but you know, kids in general, that sexual harassment is just unacceptable in all cases. There's a line in this guidance which talks about not sharing personal material which is sent to them. So it's like I talked about a couple of weeks ago, teaching the kids not to send on pictures which they might get sent as part of a relationship. You don't have the rights to send those things on. Great. And it also talks about, which is fantastic, that specifically sexual explicit material, pornography, right, presents a distorted picture of sexual behaviours, i.e. It's unlikely that you're going to find yourself in a situation that in that porn shoot that kind of thing is going to happen. Usually it doesn't. Usually the story is thin at best, and that reality is very, very different from what you see in a porn movie. So it says that pupils should know the concepts of laws relating to sexual consent, sexual exploitation, abuse, grooming, coercion, harassment, rape, domestic abuse, forced marriage, honour-based violence, and female genital mutilation. And indeed, how these can affect current and future relationships. These learning goals are actually very, very advanced, considering what the current situation is, or it was before 2019. The guidance before then was really light touch and didn't go into enough detail. It was based in the 90s. It was, you know, it didn't include porn, it didn't include all this stuff, and it's really good that it's in here now. And obviously something which I talk about on this channel a lot is consent, and this is a great line. Pupils should know how people can actively communicate and recognise consent from others, including sexual consent, so not just sexual consent is what that means, and how and when consent can be withdrawn in all contexts, including online and non-sexual way, which is great, because that's what I've been saying for ages. Well, not just me, obviously, what a lot of people have been saying for ages. And of course, it talks about contraception and STIs and alcohol and drugs and how that might lead to risky sexual behaviour. That was always in there, right? That's not new. Interesting that it talks about the menopause here. I'm pretty sure I never got talked about the menopause, and I'm pretty sure this is new in here, so that's fantastic. How to recognise positive aspects of one-to-one intimate relationships. You know, that's something I hadn't thought of. Maybe that's a video I might do in future. Watch out, it's coming your way soon. In fact, I'm gonna take some notes down, and I might do some of this myself. Obviously, it talks about the law. It also talks about gender identity and sex. And what they mean by that they are two different things, your sex and your gender. I always find it hard to explain the difference because people have said sex when they meant gender for a long, long time. So of course, all of that is fantastic, and I had read that before, but I haven't read it since July when it came out. And the good news is, from my perspective, is that there's no reason to think that the new government is going to overturn this. It's not going to get rid of this guidance. Not least because, of course, it was written and approved by a Conservative government. This wasn't a Labour government which brought this in, it's Conservative government which brought this in. And that's good for a lot of reasons, including that they're not going to get rid of it. Perhaps the test of this, though, will be the resourcing of sex education in schools. Now, of course, the new government says that they are going to put more money into schools. There's a massive argument that it's all very well having this guidance, but if we haven't got the teachers and the trainers to give the kids this education, then there's no point in the guidance. If the teachers don't know the answers, then, you know, what's the point? They need the training, or they need to bring in third-party help from either charities or organisations which can train the teachers, or the government themselves need to provide these things. But that's going to be the challenge between now and September. Is the government going to put the money in that will be maybe even ring-fenced money that will help with this new guidance, which is going to be mandatory, like I say, from September? Now, I don't know the answer to that, and there's only one way to find out, really, and that's wait until September. But there is stuff that you and I can do between now and then to maybe push it up the agenda. Now is a good time to start drafting your letters to your MP. Writing to your MP, whoever it is, by the way, is never a lost cause. They will pass it on to the relevant Secretary of State, in this case, the Education Secretary, and I think it's really worth writing to them to say, well, this is great. I love your new guidance for sex education in schools, but how are you going to fund it? And can you please give us some money for it? A budget is going to come in a few weeks' time. Now is the time to write to your brand new MP, or maybe your old MP that has just got re-elected, but write to your MP and say to them, we want more money for sex education in schools. We want this system to be properly funded, and the more money that helps train teachers or bring in outside people who are experienced in sex education, the better. And it's a great opportunity to do so because we've basically got a clean slate because we've got a brand new majority government. They might have the political will, they definitely have the power to fund sex education in schools properly. I shall link in the description to the new guidance, so why don't you have a read and let me know what you think about it. You can do that in the comments just down there. If you liked this video, then give it a thumbs up. You can do that just down below as well, and I make videos more or less every single week on sex education and welfare topics, so subscribe, click the little bell, get notified of when I next upload. Next week is Christmas, so I might not have a video for you then, but I'm thinking potentially of doing something on Christmas Eve. I'm not guaranteeing that. We'll see. But I shall hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.